Welcome to OTT Talks, a series of conversations with think tankers and policy entrepreneurs from around the world. I'm Enrique Mendizabal, and today we're joined by Ivor Chipkin, co-founder and director of the New South Institute in South Africa. We're speaking shortly after President Cyril Ramaphosa signed the Public Service Amendment Act 2025 into law. At first glance, this may sound like a technical reform to the machinery of government, but its implications are much bigger. For decades, South Africa has struggled with a difficult contradiction. Political leaders have had extensive power over appointments and administration, while senior officials have been expected to manage departments professionally and account for delivery. The new act seeks to clarify that boundary by giving heads of department greater administrative authority, while leaving political leaders to set policy, provide strategic direction, and exercise democratic oversight. The New South Institute has described this as one of the most important reforms to South Africa's system of government since 1994. Today, we will ask why this matters, how the reform came about, what role NSI played, and what does this case tell us about evidencing from policy in South Africa and beyond? Ivor, welcome.
Enrique, great. It's lovely to be here.
So I've been hearing about this reform for some time. You've been sharing developments, and also you've been sharing NSI's own efforts to bring about the change that we see happening in South Africa. And I want to take this opportunity to better understand what has been going on, and of course what NSI's role has been. But let me start with sort of setting the scene for myself, but also for those who are not so familiar with the South African context and what was happening. So I've seen, of course, your work has argued that South Africa's public service has been caught between this political control and managerial responsibility since 1994. Can you explain, maybe in more clear terms, what was going on before? What is the bill meant to solve?
Thanks. It's a great way to begin. South Africa has this extraordinary democratic breakthrough in 1994. 1994 was the first democratic election. And ANC comes to power, African National Congress comes to power in that year. Extraordinary moment historically for South Africa, but also for the world. The sense of the end, the closing of the colonial epoch, when South Africa was the last show in that regard. The apartheid state was the last colonial, African colonial regime. And this seemed to be the sort of closing of that colonial period. And the enormous exuberance and excitement around the building of democracy in post-apartheid South Africa. But the ANC comes to power with a dilemma, and a real dilemma. Well, we shouldn't underestimate this dilemma for a second. It has a very, very ambitious, very progressive ambitions around transforming apartheid South Africa and producing a new kind of society, reconstruction and development program around meeting basic needs, using the state to achieve greater equality in the economy, in society. So very ambitious plans. But one of the agreements through the negotiated political settlement is that in situ existing public servants will keep their jobs. And that means largely apartheid-era public servants, civil servants, both from the white apartheid administrations, but also don't forget that by the end of the apartheid period, the country had been broken up into a whole range of separate, in some cases nominally independent states, 4 of them, and then autonomous regions. Each one had their own civil services. So one of the terms of the negotiated agreement is that these civil services, the old apartheid public service, plus all these what we call generically Bantustans, all these Bantustan civil services will remain in place. So essentially what it means is that the African National Congress will have to realize its very ambitious, progressive policies using the administrations of the apartheid period. And of course, the African National Congress leadership is horrified by this prospect. It's stuck with this agreement. It's stuck with this deal because it's one of the agreements it made during the negotiations. But it's very, very worried about these administrations, both for their preparedness to implement their policies, but also Thabo Mbeki is even worried that they're going to be a source of counter-revolution, that they won't just not implement them, they will actively subvert these policies. So in 1994, Public Service Act of 1994, the ANC develops a workaround. It's stuck with these public servants, which it doesn't trust, and we can discuss whether that lack of faith in the public service was valid or not, but that was the situation. So they stuck with these public servants. So they develop a workaround, and the workaround is this. They will make sure that all new appointments into the public service happens through a politically controlled process so that they can exercise a maximum discretion or maximum control over new people entering the public service. So the Public Service Act makes the appointment process into the public service a political matter controlled by new ANC politicians. The president himself, cabinet ministers at national level, and then we have a tier of provincial cabinet ministers called MECs. So cabinet ministers, MECs, and the president, him or herself, have discretional control over appointment processes in the public service in terms of the Public Service Act. They also have all control over HR decisions, all kinds of decisions, promotions, terms of service, and they even, in terms of the Public Service Act, have control over operational decisions inside departments. Basic everyday decisions around how departments are organized, how they're structured, are ultimately in the hands of the politicians. So if you are a senior official, for example, actually you have no power unless those powers are delegated to you by the politician. So we can understand how historically that was meant to solve a challenge or a difficulty which the ANC inherited when it came to power. But it very, very quickly became clear that this arrangement was causing real challenges or difficulties within departments between the powers of politicians and the powers of senior officials.
So Ivor, just to clarify, so when this happened, did this develop like a parallel system? So the old civil servants that were there and still had a job, and then this new cadre of civil servants, but politically appointed, right. Or did the old ones leave?
No, that's the thing. The old ones don't leave initially. Yeah. They stay in place. They are phased out over the last 30 years. So there's been a very successful process of demographic transformation, of bringing new people into the public service. So from that point of view, the South African public service is largely transformed. But that takes a long time. In the initial decade, they're still there in many departments. And sometimes they're working very successfully. I mean, some of the big achievements of the 1990s, for example, they're extraordinary achievements in the first decade of democracy. One of them are institutional achievements, building the National Treasury, for example, building a tax collection authority for the South African Revenue Services. Enormous achievements. And some of those achievements are made possible by blending new politically aligned public servants with these old apartheid-era public servants who are committed to working with the new dispensation. Some big achievements. So it's a mixed scene, but that's the situation. New politically aligned public servants, and then a large body of apartheid-era public servants in the department.
So this is what we have. So we have now a civil service that is politically appointed, but also that has very little space, right, to run things in a professional way, because, as you said, the decisions are being made by politicians unless they are willing to delegate this authority. Now, you've described the Public Service Amendment Act as one of the most significant reforms to South Africa's system of government since 1994. So can you explain what has actually changed?
So the intervening 30 years are important in this regard. So there's some successes in the early 1990s around state building. So this model of political control is working because it's allowing the African National Congress to bring talented people into the public service to build institutions. And in some areas it's working, especially in the financial institutions. I mentioned the National Treasury, revenue collection. Quite extraordinary new administrations are built, and they're very effective and they're working well. So there's some big achievements in that regard. But from around the 2000s, it very clearly starts to go wrong. And again, it's uneven. So we go through an episode in South Africa, which is generally called state capture, a period of wide-scale corruption, of looting of public administrations. And that's largely made possible because politicians with nefarious intentions are able to bring their people into administrations. So what you start having is politicians are bringing not just politically aligned public servants into their administrations, they're bringing people in whose intentions are not exactly noble, mildly. Within the African National Congress themselves, these huge divisions are emerging within the ANC. A kind of local civil war breaks out within the African National Congress itself. And that civil war plays itself out into the administration precisely because these politicians are bringing in their allies into the civil administrations. So it's causing chaos, both politically but also in the administrations. And what you see over the last 20 years is a general decline in the performance of public administrations in South Africa, especially at national and provincial level, but also at local, at all levels. Actually, you have a huge decline in the performance of the South African state, both in terms of corruption, in looting of resources, but also just in terms of their technical ability to do their jobs is declining pretty much generally across the South African state. And then, of course, there's a huge trying to understand what's going wrong. So what we've been arguing for a long time is that one of the key instruments of this failure is this politicization of the administration. And we've been trying to make that argument for a long time now. Extraordinarily, we had a breakthrough in 2022. There's a group of a new generation of public servants, a new generation of public administration scholars become influential in government. There's a group of senior public servants in some of the departments, Department of Public Service and Administration in particular, who are sick and tired of constantly being blamed as corrupt and stupid and lacking skills for all government failures. And there's a kind of a new openness to a mood of reform. In that space, it becomes possible to start entertaining or submitting ideas for reform. And a whole range of reform ideas emerge, which some of them get consolidated around what's called the professionalization framework. This idea that South Africa can no longer continue with a public service largely appointed on political criteria, but increasingly South Africa must move to a public service appointed on the basis of merit. And it's in that space that we, myself and my colleagues at the New South Institute, are starting to build alliances and relationships both with senior public servants, but also with the South African Parliament to start pushing forward for some major legislative reform. And what this reform does, essentially, is it takes those administrative powers away from the politicians, and it gives them to the administrators themselves. So if you are a director general, for example, the most senior official in the department, or a head of department, suddenly and for the first time, the idea is you will have the authority that you will need in order to actually do your job, appoint officials, make day-to-day decisions inside your departments, how to structure your departments, how to staff your departments properly. In other words, the kinds of powers you will need in order to exercise your function on a day-to-day basis. And that's essentially what the Public Service Amendment Act does. And Enrique, just to make it not such a South African story, it's very, very similar in its character and in details, actually, to the major reforms in the US in the late 19th century, the Pendleton Act, which was implemented in the early 20th century, but largely after the Second World War. Very, very similar to the reforms, the civil service reforms which take place in France and across Europe after the end of the Second World War. Very, very similar kind of demarcating the difference between political office and administrative office. So we are, in this regard, South Africa is going in a direction which is, I think, was the tendency in Europe and America and in large parts of Latin America as well. Brazil, for example. I don't know the history of Argentina so well, but Uruguay and other Latin American states. Post-colonial Africa doesn't go in this direction for very interesting reasons during the 20th century, but there are moves in that direction in some African countries, in East Africa, Rwanda, Kenya, in West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria is even playing around with these things. So I think this is the general, the route of travel for many states, and I think it's the correct route of travel. And now South Africa, I think, is leading in that regard.
You mentioned a couple of things that I thought was interesting. So you were talking about some sectors of government, some departments. You mentioned the Treasury, for example, the Revenue Authority. There was successes. Do you find that the negative effects of the initial changes, the initial setup, were felt differently across government, where some institutions were able to maintain the professionalization of their civil servants, whereas others didn't? And this sort of makes me think of this idea of islands of excellence or pockets of efficiency within government, where this civil service professionalization is maintained, typically in treasuries, right? Typically in central banks, but is lost in other departments, education, for example, health, even, where there's a bit more of political interference. Is something like that happen in South Africa as well?
Very much. So we've got this extraordinary unevenness. This politicization of the police is an interesting one. So South Africa had extraordinarily high levels of murder through the transition. A lot of it, we have not even low key. In some parts of the country, we have a full-scale civil war. So very high murder rates, very high killing rates. During the 1990s, as the transition progresses, those rates come down. But some of those are not just political killings, it's also crime. So there's a restructuring of the police, bringing it under civilian control. These reforms, I think, are very, very successful. And what you see is a general improvement in the quality of policing, the decline in the murder rate, general decline in the crime rate. For the first time in South African history, if you're a working family, a black working family in a township, you can actually call the police to come and deal with your private emergency, whether it's a break-in. I mean, this is unprecedented in South African history.
Yeah.
The police were never a resource which black South Africans could ever draw on. But in the 1990s, they're beginning to. In the 2000s, there's a politicization of the police. And its results, I think, have been absolutely catastrophic. I mean, we're currently in the midst of a huge parliamentary inquiry and a judicial inquiry into the police because the policing in South Africa is in real crisis due to this politicization. Across the board, there's a weakening of state institutions. But there are these islands of excellence. So National Treasury, the South African Revenue Services, even though they take a real hammering during the state capture period, and I mean a real hammering, they survive that hammering. So these institutions are still largely functional. National Treasury, SARS has regained much of its professionalism, which it lost during the state capture periods, and is now starting to make great strides again back in the field of tax collection. Not great if you're a private taxpayer, but for a country, this is fundamental stuff. You need a tax authority.
And what explains this? What explains this? These islands of excellence or these pockets of efficiency? Why are these possible when around them it seems that nothing is possible?
So I think a lot of that state building in the 1990s was very successful, and a lot of it was around. Even though it was made possible through the politicization of administrations, the new politicians tended to appoint highly effective and highly capable civil servants into those departments. Okay. So you had politicization, ironically enough, facilitating high levels of professionalism in those departments. That was not always the case. And where politicization facilitated professionalization, those institutions have survived. Where it didn't, which was in most cases, those institutions have really struggled. And where we've had dramatic failures is in our state-owned enterprises. And in the South African economy, the state-owned enterprises are huge economic players, whether it's providing electricity, providing water, providing all sorts of logistics. So our economy has really taken a huge from the politicization of those institutions. So just by the way, worth noting, without getting too academic in this regard, that distinction that is often made between patrimonial public services and professional public services or civil service systems, I think we have to be very careful to fall into these normative judgments. In South Africa, in the early years, the patrimonial system, the politicized system, was actually the system that facilitated professionalization. So I think we should be very careful not to draw these kind of Berlin walls between these systems and judge them. One is good, one is bad.
But also, I think the gist of what you were saying and the gist of the amendment is also sort of clarifying that boundary, but not necessarily, as you say, building a wall, impermeable wall between the politics with a big P, the partisan politics, which is meant to represent, right? It's meant to engage with the public. It's meant to have the legitimacy that the public awards it, with the policies with the sort of small p, which is meant to kind of deliver and to respond. Right. I remember it brings me back to one of my early conversations. This is like 20 something years ago, but I remember it was an event and there was an Argentinian think tanker talking about policymaking, and he would say the politician this, the politician that, and there was a speaker next to him, I think from India, and he kept correcting him and saying, you mean policymaker, you mean policymaker. And he said, no, politician, you mean policymaker. And then the Argentinian said, well, it's the same. And, but it's also in Spanish, we sort of have the same word, right? It's sort of politics and politics, right? We have to explain políticas públicas to refer to policy. Whereas in English, it's much easier to say politics and policy, and there's a sense that these are different things, right?
Yes, French has the same.
Exactly,
yeah. La politique both refers to politics of the contestation between parties, but it also refers to kind of policy making.
Yeah.
I do think that distinction is worth making, though.
Yeah.
Because ideally, it's the politicians that are making policy. I mean, and in a democratic system, we elect politicians or we elect parties on the basis of their policy platforms. But unfortunately, in many situations, that is not what parties and what politicians are actually doing. They are not bearers or holders of the general interest. They are pursuing their own private interests or their own very partisan interests. And therefore, the idea that they are the trustees of the general interest or the public interest, I think, is often inappropriate or weak in that regard. So we do need sometimes, and this is where I think public policy making and this is where I think the role of think tanks and think tankers is so important, because in some extenses in those sorts of environments, it's very much think tankers to some extent that are the holders or the carriers of the idea of the public interest. We ourselves do not bear any private or personal interest. Our institutions are funded through philanthropic foundations or other means. And to some extent, we are the holders of some idea of the public, especially when our political parties or our politicians are pursuing their own private or partisan interests.
Yeah.
And I think,
and with that idea, so what role? I mean, you referred to it a little bit in your previous answer, but what role do think tanks play in this reform?
I mean, I think. We think so. The easy answer is to say we played a huge role, and this is all our work, and we're very excited, But I think the intellectual space and the political space which think tanks can create, I think it's really about developing ideas and generating ideas and putting them in the public domain, which are faithful to some idea of the public, that we are bearers or holders of some idea of the general interest. And I know that those ideas have been controversial in this kind of new postmodern age, but I do think political documents like constitutions, for example, do represent some sort of vision of the general interest, which is often obscured by internal party political wrangling. And I think think tankers and think tanks can be holders of this broader vision of the general interest, and therefore mobilize and activate policies and lobby on behalf of some idea of the general interest. And I think that's the area which I think where think tankers are especially good, and why they are so important. That's my sense of it.
But that means they have to get behind these principles or these documents, right, that represent the public interest. Yeah. And often think tanks feel that that's a terrain which is too political with a big P, with a capital P, and prefer to just focus on the technicalities of policy or the technicalities of just legislation.
So there's obviously a huge role around the kind of the technical implementation, and I do think a lot of think tanks add real value in the kind of doing the technical work, getting involved in the implementation.
Yeah.
But I think if we reduce think tank work to that space, I think we're obscuring or not taking advantage of a huge opportunity which is there for us, and that is to be precisely because we're independent and we can be understood as bearers of the public interest to some extent. We should be playing a much bigger role proposing and driving policy development, especially policy development that is bold, that is controversial, that is unpopular within any particular political party or any particular constellation of political parties. I think we can be critical, boldly putting out new kinds of policies. And I think that's the opportunity which think tanks have and which think tankers should be developing.
But then you need the kind of support the patient support, right? Because I'm guessing that at the beginning of the story or throughout the years, there wasn't a date where you knew things would change, right? You kept going, right? Like you said, creating spaces, lobbying, convening actors, publishing op-eds, publishing public statements, organizing events. But this isn't a project you can carefully budget for, develop a work plan for, and then when you're going to stop and evaluate it. You need that patient funding or that patient support behind you. Where does that come from today in South Africa, for example, or for NSI?
Enrique, as you know as well as I do, I mean, I've been in so many of those conversations where one is asked, okay, so what is the impact? So what is this all adding up to? You're writing lots of papers, you look very, very busy, doing lots of stuff, but what does it add up to? And the truth is, in many times, one's saying, well, I'm not sure, actually, to be honest. We are trying to open up a space of ideas. We're trying to plant ideas into the public domain. We're trying to build support for those ideas. We're trying to, if I can use an old word, we're trying to build a kind of a hegemony around a certain framework so that these ideas become normalized. But that's, incremental hard work, and it obviously doesn't always just pay off suddenly. What one needs in these regards is funders that have some sort of understand the incremental, accidental, contingent nature of this work, have enough faith that what one is doing is worthwhile, and that has enough faith in the individuals that they are potentially, if there's a chance that something can be pulled off, you can pull it off. And then spaces open up, as unexpectedly, and then you need to be in a position to enter those spaces when and if they do open up. And that's really what's happened here. We've been pushing on these doors for a long time, and then suddenly they opened. And we had the resources and we had the preparation to enter those spaces in the way in which we did. And that opening happened in 2022, and we entered that space with great eagerness, and were then able to build key relationships. Also, South Africa went through a major political shift in 2024. We had an important election where the African National Congress lost its majority in parliament. It's still the largest political party in parliament, but it's no longer the majority party. So we moved into an era of coalition parties. And I have to say that's fundamentally transformed the mood and the mood in parliament. Suddenly there is much more interest in and openness for alternative ideas. Some of the parliamentary committees are now working better than they were historically, and again, that's opened up an opportunity to advance certain ideas which were struggling in the previous period. So again, what one needs, I think, as think tankers to be in those spaces, and that's why one needs these rare funders who are not going to give you only funding on the basis of limited projects, but are there for the long haul. In South Africa, we are lucky that we still have one or two of those who are prepared to invest over the long term, and when there are opportunities, when opportunities arise, are prepared to scale up their funding. They're not many, but they do exist, and maybe that is why South Africa is unusual on the African continent, where I'm not sure those sorts of philanthropic foundations elsewhere. I think persuading international bodies to provide that kind of long-term funding, I think, is it's much more difficult to persuade them to do that. But
why is that? Because of the long-termness, or is it because of the political nature of this particular effort, for example?
I think it's the long-termness. There are international funders in my experience, the big philanthropic foundations are often operating on 3-year cycles. There's often a churn of leadership, a change of strategy, which happens quite often. And sometimes you may be in favor during one funding cycle, but suddenly you're out of favor in another cycle. And those sorts of interruptions means that you can lose out on all sorts of opportunities which may arise, not have the resources. The interruption doesn't coincide with shifts or changes in the local environment.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is just the way it is.
And thinking about the long term, of course, there's a new act now has to be implemented, right? So the story isn't over yet, right? What's the next chapter going to be about, and what kind of role can think tanks play and NSI play now that it's now about implementation? It's about rolling it out across the country.
That's the key area. I mean, this is now we're trying to build the resources and the teams required to assist in the implementation of this act, both to assist in the actual implementation and then to monitor going forward. And this requires, of course, huge resources, building new teams. And again, so we're back in the kind of fundraising game. Are there funders that are going to be open to supporting this kind of work? There's a huge amount of work in the implementation. I mean, the opportunities to game the law are enormous. A compliance which is a compliance on paper, but undermine it in practice. Huge opportunities. So we're wanting to develop a framework for the implementation, which can kind of anticipate how politicians and also senior public servants can game the system. So, and anticipate that gaming and right regulations, which can prevent it. But there's lots of also training work that needs to be done, and then monitoring and evaluation work that needs to be done. Again, I mean, you know this as well as I do. I mean, if one is in this space, one is constantly trying to find people that will believe in this work and support this work. And that is just the challenge of being in the think tank space. I think it's important, and this is why these sorts of conversations are really important, is for the recognition by other think tanks and other places in the world that these are important developments. You know, in South Africa, there is some interest in public administration, not that much. But if one can bring some attraction or some give some notice to these reforms as huge and important major events, both in South Africa, but for Africa, I think this is important on the African continent, but more generally within the global South. I think one has a much greater chance, therefore, of attracting the kinds of people that might support this work. And this is why these sorts of conversations are so important, both to inspire and potentially inform developments elsewhere in the world, but also to give attention to these kinds of developments.
And I agree with you. I think this might not sound. It's hard to grab the intervention. It's hard to think about the RCT that leads to scaling up. But if what you are describing is in the act and it works, then this will have effects on South Africa's economy, right? It'll have effect on, as you said, sort of the public enterprises and state-owned enterprises. It'll have effects on the delivery of public services across the board, whether it's education or health or housing or transport or policing. And what we tend to see is way too many funders interested in the project within education, health, policing, or housing, and not in the kind of the framework within which those projects are going to have to operate. And so you keep pouring, water into the sand, thinking, where is it? Well, it's gone because, as you said, there was a system that was just not allowing anything to stay and to grow and build up over time.
I mean, the public administration is really the kind of the framework around which all these administrations operate within or shape them. And whether it's with all these discrete interventions in health or education, etc., which don't pay attention to the administrative structure, I think are destined to have either short-term effects and to ultimately be overwhelmed by the momentum or the inertia of the broader structure, which is usually an administrative structure, or they tend not to go anywhere, precisely because one has engaged these broader processes around administration. And the truth is, administration is hard work, and it's hard slog, and it's terribly unglamorous work. But I think it's absolutely fundamental. When you get those breakthroughs, I think they will be huge. I mean, if one looks in comparative history, I mean, it's addressing these sorts of reforms that are transformational. Whether it's in the what used to be the sort of whether it's Southeast Asia, whether it's Malaysia or South Korea or China today, or it's these administrative reforms that are often the fundamental ones.
Great, but Ivor, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you very much, and I'm glad to finish with that message, right? That is these reforms that can make a huge difference across the board, and not just in any one sector. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been great to chat to you. Thank you.
And thank you for everybody who's listening. You can listen to this and other episodes on the OTT Talks series, wherever you listen to your podcast, or by visiting onthinktanks.org. From me and from the OTT team, thank you very much.